I had searched for 3 years before finding it, my forever home. A charming craftsman with cedar shingles and a welcoming front porch, but it was the backyard that stole my heart. Nearly an acre of gently sloping land that ended at the edge of Lake Serene, with ancient oak trees providing dappled shade and endless possibilities. The moment I stood on that patchy lawn, watching sunlight dance across the water, I knew this was where I would build my sanctuary. The Willowbrook Estates realtor had emphasized the strong community values maintained by an active homeowners association. "They keep the neighborhood beautiful," she assured me, "which protects your investment." The HOA fees seemed reasonable for the amenities: a community pool, tennis courts, and meticulously maintained common areas. During the home inspection, several neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves, including Corinne Thompson from across the street, the HOA president. "You will absolutely love it here," Corinne had said, her blonde bob swinging as she surveyed my property with keen interest. "This yard has such potential. I cannot wait to see what you do with it." Her smile seemed genuine, though I later recognized the calculating assessment behind her eyes. "Just be sure to submit all landscaping plans to the architectural committee," she added. "We have standards to maintain." I spent that first year transforming the neglected yard into my personal Eden. I submitted detailed landscaping plans to the HOA committee. Corinne had insisted on personally overseeing their approval, and waited the required 14 business days before breaking ground. The project consumed my weekends and savings. A flagstone patio with a pergola draped in wisteria vines, tiered garden beds bursting with native perennials, a decorative pond with water lilies and delicate Japanese maples providing privacy without obstructing lake views. I installed efficient irrigation systems, solar-powered pathway lighting, and a fire pit perfect for cool autumn evenings. Neighbors watched the transformation with admiration, often stopping to compliment my vision. Corinne became a frequent visitor, offering unsolicited advice and suggestions that I politely acknowledged then largely ignored. "Have you considered moving the rose garden?" she would ask. "The view from my kitchen window is partially blocked by that trellis." Or, "That pergola would be perfect for hosting the annual HOA appreciation lunch." I nodded and smiled, failing to recognize these comments as reconnaissance rather than neighborly conversation. The yard was featured in the community newsletter upon completion, Willowbrook's newest gem, with Corinne prominently photographed beside my koi pond, as though she had been instrumental in its creation. "This beautiful space exemplifies the potential of our lakeside properties," she was quoted saying. "It truly belongs in a magazine." What I interpreted as flattery was actually Corinne mentally cataloging my property as a community resource she could exploit. 6 months after completing the landscaping, my consulting work required a week-long business trip to Chicago. I mentioned this to my next-door neighbor Michael while collecting my mail, unaware that his wife Claire served on the HOA social committee with Corinne. This casual disclosure set in motion events that would fundamentally change my relationship with the entire community. I returned home a day early, exhausted from delayed flights and eager to spend Sunday afternoon recovering in my garden sanctuary. As I turned onto Lakeview Drive, I noticed unusual congestion, cars parked along both sides of the normally quiet street, forcing me to navigate carefully past luxury sedans and SUVs. Drawing closer to my house, I saw people in formal attire walking toward my property. A large white van marked "Elegant Occasions Catering" was backed into my driveway. Confusion gave way to disbelief as I parked behind the catering van and walked around to my backyard gate. The sight that greeted me defied comprehension. My private garden had been transformed into an elaborate wedding venue. Rows of white chairs faced the lake where an ornate floral arch now stood. My rose garden had been partially dismantled, potted plants moved aside to accommodate a champagne station. A small orchestra was setting up beside my pond, their music stands positioned where my reading bench normally sat. People in formal attire, complete strangers, milled throughout my garden, admiring the setting while caterers arranged serving tables on my patio. No one seemed to notice me standing frozen at the entrance to my own backyard, struggling to process this surreal violation. "Excuse me," I finally approached a woman with a clipboard who appeared to be coordinating the event. "What is happening here?" She looked up with professional efficiency. The Morris and Peters wedding ceremony. Are you with the florist? They have already delivered the arch and centerpieces. No, I am the homeowner. I did not authorize any wedding on my property. Her professionally composed expression faltered. That is not possible. We have all the necessary permissions from the Willowbrook Estates HOA. The venue was secured months ago. Who specifically approved this? I demanded, my voice rising as I watched a photographer directing a young couple, presumably the bride and groom, to pose beside my Japanese maple. Karen Thompson, the Homeowners Association president. She handled all the arrangements. The woman pointed across the yard. She is right over there, actually. Following her gesture, I spotted Karen standing near the wedding arch, adjusting flower arrangements and directing the photographer. She wore a pale blue dress and a self-satisfied expression that evaporated the moment she saw me approaching. I watched the calculation in her eyes, surprise at my early return, annoyance at the complication, then a rapid recalibration as she prepared to manage the situation. "You are back early," Karen exclaimed before I could speak, her voice artificially bright. "What a lovely surprise! Did you see how beautifully everything came together? The Peterson family is so grateful for your generosity in offering your gorgeous garden for their niece's special day." "I never offered my garden for anything," I stated flatly. "I never authorized anyone to use my property. These people need to leave immediately." Karen's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. She took my arm and guided me away from nearby guests who had begun to notice our conversation. "Now do not be difficult," she whispered. "The ceremony starts in 20 minutes. The HOA bylaws clearly give the association rights to utilize visually significant properties for community events when such use enhances the neighborhood's prestige and property values." "Show me that in writing," I demanded. Karen reached into a leather portfolio and produced a document, pointing to a paragraph of dense text. "Section 8, paragraph 14. Properties with significant visual or aesthetic value may, with appropriate notice, be designated for community functions that enhance the collective welfare and prestige of Willowbrook Estates." "Appropriate notice," I repeated. "I received no notice whatsoever." "We sent an email to all residents 3 months ago announcing the community wedding program," Karen replied smoothly. "Your property was listed as the inaugural venue. No objections were raised during the standard 14-day comment period." I later discovered this announcement had been buried in a 30-page monthly newsletter, described vaguely as a community celebration initiative, without specifying it involved private property use. The standard comment period had passed while I was focused on a major work project, scanning HOA communications only for items requiring immediate attention. "This is illegal," I stated. "I am calling the police." "Feel free," Karen smiled tightly. "But consider how that will appear, disrupting a young couple's wedding in front of the entire community, including several judges and the district attorney, all residents of Willowbrook. This is Emily Peterson's special day. Her father Gregory sits on the city council. Would you really ruin this beautiful ceremony over a simple misunderstanding?" I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, maintaining eye contact with Karen as I reported trespassers on my property. The responding officers arrived within 15 minutes, an eternity during which I stood awkwardly in my own garden while final wedding preparations continued around me. Karen had immediately approached the arriving guests, engaging them in animated conversation while occasionally gesturing toward me with expressions of concern. I heard fragments of her narrative. Unexpected return, miscommunication, trying to accommodate everyone. Officer Ramirez and his partner listened to my explanation with professional neutrality. When Karen presented the HOA documents authorizing community use of significant properties, the officers exchanged glances. "This appears to be a civil matter between you and your homeowners association, sir," Officer Ramirez finally said. "The HOA document does seem to grant them certain usage rights, though the notification process is unclear. Without a court order, we cannot remove these people from what the HOA has designated a community event space for today." This is my private property, I insisted. How can they simply take it over without my explicit consent? I understand your frustration, Ramirez replied, lowering his voice. But legally, when you purchased in an HOA community, you signed a contract giving them certain rights. Whether this specific use is covered would be for a civil court to decide. He handed me his card. Document everything today, consult an attorney, and file a formal complaint. That is the correct process here. The officers left, and I stood defeated in my own garden as the ceremony began. Guests seated themselves in chairs arranged where my herb garden had been transplanted to make room. The young bride looked genuinely beautiful as she processed down the stone pathway I had laid by hand over 4 painstaking weekends. Vows were exchanged beneath flowering branches of the Japanese maple I had carefully nurtured through its first vulnerable season. During the reception that followed, I remained on my porch, documenting everything with my phone camera. The caterers trampling garden beds, guests rearranging my patio furniture, someone adjusting my irrigation system controls to prevent the automatic sprinklers from activating. Several attendees glanced uncomfortably in my direction, but most enjoyed the celebration with no awareness of the property violation underway. As the reception wound down, Karen approached with a check, her expression one of magnanimous generosity. $500 for any inconvenience, she said, extending the check between 2 fingers. The standard venue fee for community events. We so appreciate your flexibility in sharing your lovely garden. The Petersons are thrilled with how everything turned out. I took the check without comment, adding it to my growing documentation. After the last guest departed, I surveyed the damage: flattened garden beds, scattered garbage, displaced stones from my carefully constructed pathway. Most concerning was the disabled irrigation system, which had been scheduled to water newly planted sections that required consistent moisture. As I reset the irrigation controls, I noticed Karen across the street, smugly watching from her driveway. She offered a little wave before disappearing into her house, her expression clearly communicating that I should consider myself honored to have provided the perfect venue for such a prestigious community event. The following weeks tested my patience and perseverance. I attended the next HOA meeting, formally presenting my complaint about the unauthorized use of my property. Karen chaired the meeting, allowing me exactly 3 minutes to speak before interrupting. As previously established in community correspondence, the Lakeside Wedding Program was fully disclosed to all residents, she stated. The standard compensation has been provided. The board considers this matter resolved. When I attempted to press the issue, Karen simply called for the next agenda item. Looking around the room, I saw several board members avoiding eye contact. I later learned that many had been wedding guests, including the HOA treasurer who had officiated the ceremony. I consulted with Martin Goldstein, an attorney specializing in property rights. After reviewing the HOA bylaws and my documentation, he sighed heavily. "You have a case," he admitted, "but pursuing it would be costly and potentially Pyrrhic. HOAs wield considerable power, and they can make life extremely difficult for residents who challenge them. Legal proceedings would take months, possibly years, and even if you prevail, you would still have to live in a community where the leadership considers you adversarial. So they can simply take over my private property without consequences?" I asked incredulously. "I did not say that," Martin replied, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Sometimes the most effective response operates outside conventional legal channels while remaining entirely lawful. The question becomes, what message do you want to send and to whom?" His words resonated with me long after our meeting. What had occurred was not merely a bylaw violation, but a fundamental breach of boundaries, enabled by Karen's position of authority and the community's passive acceptance of her overreach. Traditional remedies seemed inadequate to address this deeper violation. The solution came from an unexpected source. Among my consulting clients was Victor Menendez, owner of Iron Horse Motorcycle Repair and president of the Guardians Motorcycle Club. I had helped Victor navigate complex zoning regulations when expanding his business 2 years earlier, developing a relationship based on mutual respect despite our different backgrounds. The Guardians were not the stereotypical motorcycle club portrayed in sensationalist media. Their membership included veterans, first responders, and business owners who shared a passion for motorcycles and community service. Their annual toy drive for the Children's Hospital was legendary, and they provided scholarship funds for trade school students throughout the county. I arranged to meet Victor at his shop, a converted warehouse where the scent of motor oil and leather permeated the air. Custom motorcycles in various stages of restoration filled the space, attended by mechanics whose expertise was evident in their methodical movements. Victor greeted me warmly, his imposing physical presence, 6'4" with shoulders like a linebacker, contrasting with his thoughtful demeanor. After catching up on business matters, I explained my situation, describing Karen's breathtaking entitlement and the HOA's dismissal of my legitimate grievances. People see a title like president and assume legitimate authority, Victor observed, absently polishing chrome as he listened. Then people like your neighbor start believing they actually have powers beyond what any reasonable person would accept. I have seen this before. Someone gets a little authority and suddenly thinks they are above common decency. Exactly, I agreed. And conventional responses seem inadequate. A lawsuit might eventually provide some compensation, but it would not address the fundamental disrespect. Victor set down his polishing cloth. What exactly are you proposing? Something memorable but completely legal, I replied. Something that communicates boundaries in language Karen will understand. Victor considered this for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. The club holds monthly meetings. We rotate locations, usually members' properties or occasionally public parks with proper permits. We are always looking for new venues. How many members typically attend? I asked, an idea taking shape. Usually 40 to 50, plus their bikes. A smile slowly spread across Victor's face as he grasped my thinking. I assume your HOA has noise ordinances. Yes, but they only restrict noise levels before 8 a.m. or after 10 p.m. on weekends, I replied. And city ordinances supersede HOA rules regarding properly permitted events. Victor nodded appreciatively. I like how your mind works. Let me discuss this with the club officers. If we proceed, we do it right. All necessary permits secured, everything documented and completely legal. We would be guests on your property, behaving respectfully but visibly. That is exactly what I had in mind, I confirmed. Respect and boundaries are the message. Nothing illegal, nothing threatening, just a clear demonstration that actions have consequences. As Victor walked me out, he introduced me to several club members working in the shop. I was struck by their thoughtfulness as we discussed the situation. Many shared stories of encountering prejudice based on their appearance or chosen lifestyle. People like your HOA lady see the leather and the bikes and make all kinds of assumptions, explained Maria, a retired Army nurse who maintained the club's medical supplies for charity rides. They never bother looking past the surface. The opportunity to implement our plan arrived sooner than expected. 2 weeks after the wedding, my neighbor Michael mentioned that Karen was hosting an important garden brunch for regional HOA leaders. It is a big deal for her, he explained. Representatives from all the luxury communities in the county. She is angling for a position on the regional HOA council. Been planning it for months. This Sunday? I asked casually. Yes, starts at 10 a.m. She has been driving Claire crazy with the preparations. I texted Victor that evening. The perfect opportunity has presented itself. His response was immediate. Permits secured, weather looks favorable, Operation Respect and Boundaries is approved. That Friday, I encountered Karen at Willowbrook Market, selecting pastries from the bakery section. Her cart contained expensive cheeses, gourmet crackers, and several bottles of champagne. Big plans this weekend? I inquired innocently. Just a small leadership gathering, she replied, unable to suppress her pride. The Lakeside Communities Association is considering my proposal for standardizing architectural guidelines across neighborhoods. Sunday's presentation could be quite influential for Willowbrook's standing. How wonderful for you, I replied. I hope everything unfolds exactly as deserved. Her self-absorbed enthusiasm prevented her from noticing my precise wording. She was too busy explaining the importance of her brunch to register the quiet satisfaction in my expression. Sunday morning dawned clear and perfect, 70 degrees with a gentle breeze off the lake. From my kitchen window, I watched Corinne directing caterers and setting up elegant tables in her backyard. She had spared no expense. Fine linens, fresh flower arrangements, even uniformed staff to park guests' vehicles. By 9:30 a.m., everything was arranged to showcase both her garden and her leadership capabilities to maximum advantage. The first luxury vehicles began arriving at 10 a.m. sharp. Men and women in business casual attire made their way up Corinne's curved walkway, greeted effusively by their hostess. I recognized several HOA presidents from nearby communities, the property manager who oversaw multiple luxury developments, and even a county commissioner known for supporting development interests. I had positioned chairs and a refreshment table in my front yard and driveway, with additional seating on the porch. Everything was ready for the Willowbrook Community Motorcycle Awareness and Appreciation event that had been properly permitted through the City Parks and Recreation Department, bypassing HOA approval entirely by classifying it as a public education event. At precisely 10:30 a.m., the distant rumble of motorcycles grew steadily louder. Victor had choreographed their arrival perfectly, not as an intimidating mass, but in smaller groups of 5 to 7 riders, approaching from different directions to extend the acoustic introduction of their presence. The first riders appeared at the entrance to Willowbrook Estates, their motorcycles gleaming in the morning sunlight. They proceeded at exactly the legal speed limit, maintaining proper formation as they made their way toward my property. I could see Corinne's brunch guests pausing mid-conversation, turning to locate the source of the increasingly prominent engine notes. The Guardians arrived with impressive discipline, each motorcycle parking in my driveway or along the street in perfect compliance with municipal codes. Over 50 bikes in total, ranging from vintage Harley-Davidsons to custom choppers and sleek modern sport bikes. Their riders, many in leather vests displaying the Guardians' emblem, dismounted with practiced ease. Victor arrived last, his candy apple red cruiser rumbling to a stop at the foot of my driveway. He removed his helmet and extended his hand in greeting. "Beautiful day for a community awareness event," he observed with a slight smile. "Everyone has their permits and identification as discussed." I welcomed the Guardians warmly, offering the coffee, donuts, and breakfast burritos I had arranged on tables in the front yard. Music began playing from portable speakers at precisely the legal volume limit, classic rock that provided ambience without violating any noise ordinances. Across the street, Corinne's carefully orchestrated brunch was deteriorating rapidly. Her guests' attention had completely shifted to the spectacle unfolding on my property. The contrast was cinematic. On one side, stiff formality and forced networking. On the other, genuine camaraderie and animated conversation. Every few minutes, a motorcycle engine would start as someone repositioned their bike or demonstrated a custom feature to an admiring audience, the sound cutting through Corinne's carefully planned presentations. I watched with quiet satisfaction as Corinne's expression transitioned from confusion to recognition to fury. When she marched across the street, her face flushed with indignation, Victor stepped forward to intercept her. "Good morning, neighbor," he greeted her pleasantly. "Beautiful day for community gatherings." "What is the meaning of this?" Corinne demanded, visibly struggling to maintain her composure in front of her important guests, many of whom were now watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. "The first annual Willowbrook Community Motorcycle Awareness and Appreciation event," I explained, joining them. "Fully permitted through the city." I presented the official documentation, which Victor had helped secure. "We are showcasing these beautiful machines while educating the community about motorcycle safety and the charitable work of local riding clubs." This is outrageous," Corinne spluttered. "The HOA never approved this event." "Interesting perspective," I replied calmly. "I was under the impression that properties with significant visual or aesthetic value may, with appropriate notice, be designated for community functions that enhance the collective welfare and prestige of Willowbrook Estates. I quoted the very bylaw she had used to justify commandeering my backyard. Corinne's expression shifted as she recognized her own words being used against her. Before she could respond, I reached into my pocket and handed her an envelope. $500 for any inconvenience, I said, echoing her exact phrasing from the wedding day. The standard compensation for community events. We so appreciate your flexibility as a neighbor. Victor maintained a respectful but unmovable presence beside me, his considerable stature and calm demeanor making Corinne's indignation seem increasingly petty. Several of her brunch guests had wandered over, curiosity overcoming their initial hesitation. "These cannot possibly be street legal," Corinne attempted, gesturing at the assembled motorcycles. "I am calling the police." "Please do," Victor replied pleasantly. "Many of our members are current or former law enforcement. They would enjoy reconnecting with colleagues." As if on cue, a Guardian's member named Robert approached, extending his hand to Corinne. "Robert Delgado, retired county sheriff's deputy. Each bike here has been inspected and meets all legal requirements. We maintain excellent relationships with local law enforcement through our annual fundraiser for the Officers Benevolent Association." The carefully constructed power dynamic that Corinne had established in the neighborhood began to crumble before my eyes. When she retreated to make her call, several of her brunch guests remained, drawn by the unexpected authenticity of the gathering on my property. One distinguished-looking man in his 60s approached a vintage Harley, admiring its restoration. The bike's owner, a Guardian named James, began explaining the historical significance of that particular model. I later learned the admirer was the president of the most exclusive HOA in the county, and a former motorcycle enthusiast himself. When police did arrive, responding to Corinne's complaint about noise violations, they confirmed all our permits were in order and sound levels within legal limits. One officer even recognized several Guardians from a recent charity event. "Everything appears to be in compliance here," the officer informed Corinne, who had triumphantly led him to my property. "They have proper permits for a community education event." He nodded respectfully to Victor before returning to his patrol car, leaving Corinne standing speechless on the sidewalk. What happened next exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by curiosity about the gathering. Rather than finding the chaotic disruption they perhaps anticipated, they discovered a well-organized, respectful event. Guardians members welcomed them, offering refreshments and answering questions about their motorcycles and community service initiatives. Children were particularly fascinated by the bikes. James, the vintage Harley owner, patiently helped kids sit on his parked motorcycle for photos, explaining basic safety principles to parents. Maria organized an impromptu helmet fitting demonstration, emphasizing the importance of proper safety equipment. Corinne made increasingly desperate attempts to salvage her brunch, but the paradigm had shifted irrevocably. Several of her guests made excuses to leave early, some stopping by my event before departing. The county commissioner spent 30 minutes in deep conversation with Victor about veteran support programs the Guardians helped fund. By early afternoon, the most remarkable transformation was underway. The artificial boundary between respectable Willowbrook residents and the intimidating motorcycle enthusiasts had dissolved. Conversations flowed across surprising connections. A retired banker and a tattoo-covered mechanic discovering they had served in the same military unit. A kindergarten teacher and a leather-clad grandmother exchanging notes on childhood education. An HOA architectural committee member and a custom bike builder discussing design aesthetics. Corinne eventually retreated into her house, her carefully planned status demonstration in shambles. Her final attempt to reassert control, a mass email to all Willowbrook residents about disruptive unauthorized gatherings, backfired spectacularly when recipients recognized her hypocrisy in light of the wedding incident, which had now become common knowledge. The weeks following our motorcycle awareness event brought remarkable changes to Willowbrook Estates. At the next HOA meeting, attendance reached unprecedented levels. Residents who had suffered under Karen's selective rule enforcement for years found their voices, sharing stories of arbitrary fines and inconsistent application of bylaws. Karen faced a vote of no confidence, losing her position as board president to Michael's wife Claire, who ran on a platform of transparency and respect for homeowner rights. The new board's first action was amending the bylaws to require explicit written homeowner consent for any use of private property for community events. The Guardians Motorcycle Club received several invitations to participate in legitimate community functions, including the annual Willowbrook charity fundraiser. Victor and I developed a genuine friendship beyond our initial alliance of convenience, and I eventually joined their annual hospital charity ride. 6 months later, I hosted a garden party in my restored backyard, this time with explicit invitations to both neighbors and several Guardians members. The sight of leather-clad bikers chatting amicably with suburban homeowners over punch and cookies symbolized how thoroughly our community had transformed. Karen listed her house for sale the following month, unable to adapt to a neighborhood where her authority had been permanently diminished. Before moving, she avoided community gatherings and kept to herself, occasionally glaring across the street at my thriving garden, the site of her most significant miscalculation. 1 year after the wedding incident, the Willowbrook community installed a bench near the lakefront, funded jointly by residents and the Guardians Motorcycle Club. Its simple bronze plaque reads, "Dedicated to respect, boundaries, and unlikely friendships." I often sit there in the evenings, watching the sunset reflect across Lake Serene, marveling at how a community can be transformed when people stand up to petty tyranny. My garden continues to flourish, hosting occasional small gatherings of neighbors and Guardians members alike. The roses have never bloomed more beautifully, their roots undisturbed by unauthorized venues, their growth strengthened by having weathered the storm.